So thank you everyone for coming and to the organizers for putting the paper in the program. This is joint work with David Yang and Noam. I think Noam is around, so he may be answering questions as we go. So I'm going to be talking about data-intensive innovation and the state, showing you some evidence from AI firms in China. And so the motivation for this paper comes, there's been a lot of talk about AI technologies recently. It's becoming increasingly widespread and a lot of interest both for economists as well as policymakers in understanding better the implications of this type of technologies. And one of the features that has been emphasized at length regarding the development of AI technologies is that they are a data-intensive technology. So the development of AI algorithms and AI software requires, not only algorithms, but also training these algorithms on potentially very large data sets. And the availability of these data sets in recent decades is one of the things that has been emphasized as having been one of the key promoters of this type of innovation, and less so, for instance, say new researchers or new algorithms working on it. And what I'm going to try to convince you today is that in this type of data-intensive economies, where maybe these are not the economy that we live now, but future economies where AI technologies are important, the direction of innovation and growth may be crucially shaped by the state. And the reason for that is the following. We're going to try to draw you that the data differs from more traditional inputs in two ways. The first one is that historically and up to the present, states have been key collectors and repositories of data. From individual data to be able to carry taxation and provide public services, to police data collected by the police, video from cameras, images, and whatnot. And so historically, the state has been collecting data. In fact, this is something that I learned from working on this project. State is at the root of the worst statistics, and so that's the first feature of data that we're going to emphasize. The second one is that the nature of data is such that it can be shared across multiple uses, and in particular can be shared across multiple uses within the firm. And this is something that we're going to emphasize here. And other work has emphasized the shareability across firms. This is mostly all going to be about the shareability across uses within the firm. And in particular, we're going to argue that these features of data may give rise to economies of scope from firms having access to government data. And in particular, you can think about an AI firm obtaining a contract with the government to produce AI software, say for a police department, and gaining access to government data that is not publicly available, like video from cameras on the streets, and then potentially could use that data not only to develop the AI software that it was contracted to produce for the government unit, but also for the much larger commercial market. And to the extent that this is important, then this will mean that the state can potentially crucially shape how both the direction in terms of how biases towards data-intensive technologies is, and also the aggregate growth rate in this economy. Okay, so that's the argument. So what we're going to start by asking is, are there in fact economies of scope arising from government data empirically? And to get at this question, we're going to study, I think, a kind of an excellent setting, which is of a data-intensive industry where there's a significant involvement of the state, which is the facial recognition AI industry in China. And so most of the talk I'm going to spend on the evidence on economies of scope. Then the next part of the paper is going to be trying to move away from that micro evidence and ask what would be the macro implications of firms having access to this type of government data when they are innovating on this type of government and commercial software that uses government data. And to get at this, we're going to build on a very standard directed technical change model, and we're going to add the fact that data is an input and that the economies of scope exist. And then we're going to think about the macro implications of that. And then I'm going to end with discussing two applications that kind of illustrate different ways in which data-intensive innovation may be shaped by the state, and both directly, and probably I'm going to focus more on this one today, by setting industrial policy and in the sense of a policy of government data provision directly to the firms, but also indirectly, they may affect both the direction of innovation and growth by choosing, for instance, how much surveillance there is in an economy, as well as enacting privacy regulation. So I'll spend the last part of the talk on that. Okay, so let's start with the evidence. So as I was saying, I think this is a kind of a prototypical setting in which to study the role of the state in data innovation. One of the two of the main reasons being that facial recognition software requires access to large data sets, and in particular requires access to data sets that allow linking faces to personal identifiers. And so sometimes it's called both linked facial or image data, which has a name and a face. And sometimes other types of data is that it's linkable. In the sense that sometimes we only have the faces, but we don't have the names, or we have videos from a person, but we don't have the names. And both of these go into the training of the AI algorithms. And it just turns out that the Chinese government, and here I don't want you to think about the Chinese state as a whole, but smaller units of the Chinese government that are more local, like say a local police department, has access to this type of data, for instance, from video feeds on the streets, and also demand this type of data-intensive AI software for carrying out their normal activities. In the case of the police departments, would be to survey and monitor their citizens. So what is the mechanism that we have in mind? And just repeat more or less with more detail what I said before. Let's think about a firm that receives a government procurement contract. For instance, this is a facial recognition software firm that receives a contract to produce a certain, say, surveillance software for a municipal police department. And with this contract, it receives access to government data, which is not publicly available. And this is kind of important. And in particular, receives, for instance, video from street cameras and also labeled personal images of the citizens of a given a city or region that is under the scope of this police department. And then it's going to use this data to develop government software, but to the extent that it can share the data across uses, it can also use it to develop commercial applications new commercial AI software using this same data. In particular, for instance, it can train an algorithm. Suppose the contract is for an AI software which requires training an algorithm for detecting individuals in video from street cameras. Sometimes there could be also a prediction step. For instance, if you're trying to identify potential offenders, that's something that the company may do as well. But crucially, then it can use that same data to train another algorithm that has nothing to do with the government and is instead catered to the commercial sector. For instance, for a supermarket that is trying to detect shoppers in videos from retail and from retail store cameras, and then potentially also this supermarket can try to make predictions about consumer purchases, and that would be something that would add to the AI software that this firm may be producing. Okay. So then what this is saying is that potentially economies of scope may arise from the shareability of data, and in particular from firms gaining access to government data. But I want to note, though, that this is not necessarily the case, that it may be that even when data is shareable, economies of scope may not arise. For instance, if the fact that the firm needs to produce the government software that is required by the contract, this may crowd out resources from commercial software. So in fact, we may not observe that a firm obtaining a government contract that provides access to more data produces both more commercial and government software, if this is the case. So that's an empirical question and it's a key prediction that we're going to test next. Okay, so in order to get at this, we had to kind of overcome three empirical challenges that they were about. Essentially, the data did not exist to get at this question. So the first thing that we needed was a data set that linked AI firms to government contracts. This didn't exist, so we're gonna collect and create that data. Then the second one is a data set on the software produced by these AI firms. And not only that, we also needed to categorize this or classify this software by the intended use. In particular for us, whether the intended customer would be a government unit or a commercial firm like a supermarket. And finally, we need a way of measuring access to government data following the receipt of a contract at the firm level. And again, I think this is one of the, we're gonna do something here, and we're gonna construct a proxy for access to government data, and hopefully I think we're doing a good job, but we'll see. But I think this is not only special to this paper, but in the whole literature on data, this is one of the key measurement issues. How do we measure data at the data access at the more micro level? And then there's, on top of these data challenges, there's more typical identification challenges that have to do with the government contract not being randomly assigned, and as well as trying to disentangle the effects on data compared to other mechanisms that aren't related to data, but could also look like giving rise to economies of scope. So we'll talk about those later. Okay, so the first step is we're gonna use two sources, one public and one private, which is gonna give us a list of all the facial recognition AI firms in China. And then we're also gonna obtain the universe of all government contracts. These turned out to be quite easy these are listed by the Chinese government, the particular Minister of Finance. And a government contract looks like this. So of course, I don't expect you to read Chinese. I don't. But what is important here is that a government contract tells us who's the buyer, the name of the buyer, who's the supplier, who's the AI firm that won this contract, and what are the products and services that were produced, when did it happen, and there's other variables that we're going to use, like the monetary scale. But importantly here is that by having a list of all the facial recognition AI firms, then we can link all the names with the supplier that we have here. So this allows us to link the government buyers to the AI suppliers. So that's the first step that we have. Okay. The second step is, we thought it was going to be quite difficult, but it turned out that the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology actually has a registry of all the software releases that AI firms have, and it requires them to register them there. So then we can know what are the name of the software release, and also description of what this software is. It turns out that we can validate this in one case, which is MEG-B, one of the largest AI firms in China, that went public. And in the IPO prospectus, they actually list what's all their software, and it turns out that the ones that coming from the registry and the IPO prospectus actually match very well. And in fact, we have some that are not there. So now we have firms, and we have the names, and we have their software releases. But what we need to do next is categorize this by their intended customers. And to do this, we used machine learning text analysis, and I'm not going to go into the details of how we did that. This was our assistants were great help here. But the important thing is that we were able to, by manually label many of these softwares, and then using that as a training corpus, we're able to categorize them in three categories. First, whether the software was intended for the government, and for instance, something that would be a software for the government is an AI software that says smart city real-time monitoring system on main traffic routes. Okay, so that is something that we would classify as being for the government. Something that would classify as being commercial, it would be a visual recognition system for smart retail. So that's something that is intended for a firm. And then there's a third category that we're not going to use, and are things that really, from the description, you couldn't really tell who the intended customer was, and so we're just going to put it in a general category. Okay, so now what we had in this second step. So now we had linked government contracts to firms, and we also have the firm software releases, and we have also split the software releases on whether they were for the government or commercial applications. And then the last step is measuring how much access to government data was associated with the government contract that these firms obtained. And to get at this, we're going to do two things, and where the second one is our preferred one, but we're going to do it in two steps. So first, we're going to look at variation across contract types, in particular whether a contract is coming from a public security agency, like a police department, versus a non-public security agency, like a bank or a school or a hospital, the public ones, right, from the government. And the logic here being that police departments, for instance, because they have access to surveillance, large surveillance networks, then they're going to be able to provide, they have access to much larger data sets, and these potentially are provided to the firms. For instance, one of the contracts that we have is with the police department in Heilongjiang province. And this is, the contract is for a facial recognition system that can store and analyze at least 30 million facial images, which is the whole people in this province. Whereas a contract with the provincial bank, by necessity, the bank is much smaller, then the system was to provide identification service only for the bank's clients. So then the quantity of data presumably is much smaller here. Now, of course, you may worry, and we did, that there's many other reasons why either firms would select differently into public versus non-public security contracts, and maybe even the production of this type of software is completely different. So our preferred specification actually is going to look only at variation within the set of AI public security contracts. So think about police departments, essentially. And what we're going to do is try to measure contracts that are particularly data rich within the set of public security contracts as those that are coming from prefectures where the surveillance network is larger. And in particular, we're going to measure this by the quantity of advanced street cameras in the network of this police department in this prefecture. And to measure this, the stock of advanced street cameras, we're going to use a completely different set of contracts, which are government contracts with essentially hardware firms that are selling the cameras. And by looking at all the purchases, all the contracts coming out of a given public security agency or police department, we can look at we can accumulate that flow of purchases and come out with a measure of the stock of street cameras in a given prefecture. And then we're simply going to say that a public security contract is particularly data rich in the sense that it gives access to potentially to more government data to the firm obtaining a contract from that agency if it is coming from a prefecture where the surveillance network is large and there's a lot of street cameras. Okay, so that is the part of the data construction. For today, I'm only going to show you the results for public security contracts and see the paper if you want for the public versus non-public. And what we're going to do is kind of a simple triple diff specification that is essentially going to compare all the software releases, cumulative software releases, before and after an AI firm receives their first data-rich contract, differentially from the firms receiving a data-scarce contract. And again, a data-rich contract is a contract with, say, a police department that has access to above median surveillance capacity measured by the number of cameras. And for our baseline, we can control for time fixed effects, firm fixed effects, and a number of firm characteristics like age, size, and software production. Okay. So what is it that we find? What we find is, so we look, for instance, first at the new cumulative new releases of government of AI software intended for the government. What we see is that a firm that obtains its first public security contract when it is richer in data, in the sense that it's coming from a place that has a larger surveillance network, then we see that that firm, it releases about 3 new software products compared to a firm that instead obtained a public security contract, but from a place that has a relatively small surveillance network. Okay, so that's the first piece of evidence. The second piece of evidence is that now on economies of scope is that we see these same firms not only producing differentially more government software, but also commercial software. And in particular, for instance, a firm obtaining access to more government data would produce differentially more 2 units, will release 2 more cumulative software over the first 3 years in this case. Okay, and we're going to interpret this as being evidence that there are indeed economies of scope coming from access to more government data coming from these contracts. And you may worry and wonder, and we did, whether the trends are that maybe the differential effects between data scarce and data rich contracts are coming because say obtaining a contract actually makes everyone produce less software, but it's just differentially less for the data scarce. That's not what's going on. If you look at the total effects of software releases when a firm obtains a contract from a low capacity versus a high capacity, the effects are quite large, in fact, for both, but they're differentially higher when the contract is coming from a high capacity perfection. And the same is true for commercial software. Okay, so then, so that's we're gonna take that as evidence that there are economies of scope. Some additional evidence that then we look at some additional evidence that data is in fact an important input into innovation, and in particular to this mechanism. For instance, you may think that if contracts that are in fact data rich, then the bids for those type of contracts, to the extent that data is valuable, should be lower, and there should be more bidders overall. And we find that in when we look at the bids and bidders in government contracts. We then look at a different category of software releases that have not AI, but instead are what we call data complementary. For example, these are softwares that when you look at the descriptions, they are about data storage, and they have to do with data storage and data transmission, and we call those data complementary software. And the idea here being that, if these firms are indeed obtaining access to large quantities of data, they may have to develop ways of managing and storing that data, and sometimes they release software that allows firms to do so, and then sell it potentially. And that we also find that in fact, when a firm obtains a contract that we classify as data rich, they not only release differentially more government and commercial AI software, but they also release more of these data complementary software. And then finally, we also look at firms using video facial recognition instead of all facial recognition, and which is a particularly data-intensive type of facial recognition innovation, and where to get at the same level of accuracy, you actually need larger quantities of data. And in line with what you would expect, we actually find that the magnitude of the coefficients, when you just focus on this subcategory of facial recognition, the magnitude of the coefficients of the effect of data on government and commercial software releases doubles. And so that's kind of some confirmatory evidence that of the importance of data as an input in this context, of government data as an input. So then, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this. Probably there's going to be a lot of questions, so I'll take them in the later on. But we look at a number of alternative hypotheses that we were worried about. That in fact, maybe the mechanism is not really data, and even if you believe that obtaining a government contract actually gives you incentivizes innovation both in government and commercial applications, maybe it's not about data. Maybe it's about something else. So the first, of course, will be something about selection. I think in particular, it needs to be selection that is different at the time of the contract receipt and between what we classify as data rich and data scarce contracts, not just in terms of obtaining a contract. And to get at this, we don't really see differential pre-trends, and we have a number of firm controls as well. So I think we're doing a relatively good job there. We looked also where the terms and tasks differ by contract. So maybe that's where we're finding difference between data rich and data scarce contracts. When we control for a measure of the distance in the language of the contracts or the type of software, we don't really see that can explain the differences. And then finally, where I was particularly worried about this not really being about data, but in fact being about learning by doing, that a firm obtaining a government contract was actually, and producing for the government, would actually learn from that and hence produce commercial software out of it. And to get at that, what we did two things. So first, we looked at what happens when we control for software releases before obtaining the first contract, and this really decreases the coefficients a bit, but not much. And again, the story is not that there's no learning by doing. The story needs to be that the learning by doing possibilities are differentially stronger for what we classify as a data rich versus data scarce contract. Of course, in the levels, it could be the case that there is learning by doing, and I believe there is. But it may not be differentially stronger for one type of contract or the other. And another piece of evidence that it doesn't seem to be that is that you would expect it that the possibilities for learning by doing are different for the two types of contracts. Then the types of software being released in terms of the characteristics should be different as well, because the production technologies that go into making them should be different. And we don't really see that when we look at the descriptions of the government data of the government software that is produced. And we can talk about other ones later, like maybe the contracts give signals. It's not about data. Maybe they give maybe it's about capital, access to capital. So we can talk about those later. Okay, so that's the evidence. So now, of course, the fact that we see that more access to government data increases innovation and maybe biases direction towards AI software does not imply that if we did this experiment in the aggregate of giving giving firms access to government data, this would do increase aggregate innovation or bias the direction of innovation. And neither implies that this would be desirable at all in terms of welfare. In particular, by increasing innovation, this takes resources. It could be that these crowds have resources from consumption and welfare decreases, and we'll try to study this. And in particular, it could also be that households have preferences for surveillance and data collection directly, and hence may not be desirable to increase surveillance and increase data collection. So to get at this question, we're going to write down a directed technical change model where data is an input. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to go over the model, but I'll just kind of list the key ingredients, at least what I think are the key ingredients, compared to the standard Acemoglu type directed technical change model. So the first one is that there's going to be a state that's going to collect government data and demand a type of software that we're going to call data intensive, in the sense that it requires data in order to be produced. And the state is going to buy this AI or data intensive government software to produce an aggregate good that we're going to call a surveillance services. Okay? And this may or may not be valued by the citizens, and it may be valued only by the state. And we can study the alignment between the preference of the state and households too. And then the second thing is that, as in our empirical application, we're going to allow firms to access to a fixed quantity of government data by selling software to the state. So there will be no market for this type of government data, which we're going to call DG. Instead, by producing government software for the state, the contract allows them to access a fixed quantity of data, and there's no other way in which they can access it if they don't produce for the state. And then we're going to assume, and this is the key assumption, that government data can be used not only to produce government software for the state, but also commercial software as well that uses data too. And then this commercial software is an intermediate input into the production of a final consumption good that is consumed by a household. But we're also going to allow not to cook kind of the results in the model, that there's also a private market for data. So there's going to be another type of data, which we're going to call private data. And then all firms can access this market for private data where there's a price. And importantly, we're gonna assume that this private data is a gross substitute with government data. And the reason for that is such that we can have an equilibrium that not all firms need to go through the government. So we're gonna look at the balanced growth path where there's a free entry of innovators and three types of firms. There's gonna be a type of firm that is producing for both the state and for commercial applications. And by producing for the state, is gonna get access to government data, and it's also going to combine that with private data and produce both government and commercial software. There's going to be another type of firm or innovator that is going to produce for the state at all, and hence will not access this government data, and instead it will produce commercial software only, using only private data and not government data. And then finally, there's going to be a third type of firm, which we're going to call just non-software, that does not use data at all in production. Okay, and these are going to be the three sectors. If you want, and importantly, the commercial software and non-software are combined to produce the final good, and the government software goes into the production of this government good that we call surveillance. Okay, so those are the key ingredients. The rest of the paper is the rest of the setup is, the innovators spend resources to innovate on varieties, and there's free entry and so on, as in the typical small model. Okay, so the first result that we're going to look at is what happens when you increase access to government data when a firm contracts with the state, when a firm provides, when a firm produces government software. And what we find is that you can show that in a balanced growth path, to the extent that it exists, and as long as the relative demand for commercial software is sufficiently elastic, then both the growth rate and the bias of both the growth rate increases where in an economy where the state is providing more data to the firms, but also the aggregate bias of innovation increases in the sense that the total innovation is more biased towards total private innovation, is more biased towards data-intensive software. Okay, and the key part here is private. So this is not just saying that total data-intensive innovation increases relative to total non-data-intensive innovation, but in the private sector, so the commercial part increases in data-intensive software compared to the non-software. Okay, and this is essentially because of the economies of scope, that by giving more access to government data, the firms then turn around, not only produce more government software, but they also produce more of the commercial data-intensive software, and hence that bias is the private direction of innovation. Okay, so that's the first result, and then the second result is going to be more normative instead of positive. And the question is, there's no reason why in this economy the state would like to increase data and increase the growth rate, because and this is as in other models as well, it may be that the higher innovation that the more data induces also crowds out resources from consumption, and while the growth rate of consumption increases, the level may decrease, and then this trade-off actually may make the provision of government data undesirable. And there's two ways in which this crowd-out may happen. One is that innovation directly takes resources, so to produce new varieties and innovate, that crowds out the final good from consumption, but also producing more government surveillance takes other intermediate goods that are also taken away from consumption. So both things generate this trade-off by which you may have an interior solution or not in terms of how much data you wanna provide. So what we do is look at a kind of a simple second best optimization problem. And it's second best because there's other inefficiencies that have to do with the monopoly power of the innovators. But we're just gonna allow the state to choose what is the optimal level of data that it wants to give to the firms. And for this calibration of the model, and this is just an example, you get an interior solution where for instance, the government spending share would be something like 0.8% of output. If you provide too little data and then you produce too little surveillance of which data is generated as a byproduct, then it would be optimal for you to increase your data and increase surveillance a bit, because by doing so, you increase the growth rate more than you crowd out resources. But if you're in this side, the opposite is true. The crowd out resource actually dominates, and you would like to provide less data. So in a sense, if you're familiar with this older paper by Barrow, which studies the provision of government goods and services that directly increase firm productivity, like infrastructure. And this result, I think, is very reminiscent of that type of result. In this case, the key input provided by the government is not infrastructure, it's data, and it directly affects the productivity of firms and innovators. And in that paper, you have a very similar trade-off than we do here. The second thing that I would like to ask is, well, is it always true that there will be an interior solution, or is it possible that sometimes it will be optimal to not provide any government data and don't produce surveillance and don't produce any data in interior? And the answer is yes. And so, for instance, for the calibration that we had, which actually matches the economies of scope that are implied by our reduced form estimates. So we got a parameter that governs economies of scope. It puts us somewhere here. But if you just make economy scope relatively weak, then government's data provision just stops being desirable. For instance, if this parameter would be less than 0.7, and then it's never optimal to produce any data, any government data in equilibrium, and the economy just works with private data. And the reason there is essentially because the crowd out of resources is just too strong compared to the effect on the growth rate. And remember, because the effect of the growth rate of providing more data increases with the degree of with the strength of economies of scope, because that allows you to increase productivity even more in the commercial sector. All right. So then, in the last how much I have? Excellent. In the last minutes that I have, let me just end with what I think are the contributions to the literature and some of the takeaways from the applications through the lens of the literature. So first, of course, I think there's a contribution to the literature on the economics of AI, and which has highlighted, for instance, the non-rivalry of data across firms and of private data in particular. I think what we're doing here is that we're highlighting the role of the state as a collector of data and economies of scope from the shareability of data across uses, but within the firm instead of across firms. In that sense, I think it complements that literature nicely. The second, I think, is of course to the literature industrial and innovation policies. And maybe since this crowd is more interested in the industrial part, given the title, let me talk a bit about that. So here we first starting a frontier technology, as opposed to, a lot of the very nice industrial policy literature is studying historical episodes by necessity, and here we're actually studying kind of a frontier technology that is relevant right now, and propose a mechanism in which the government may affect innovation in this technology. And interestingly, the reasons why a policy that provides, and let's call it industrial policy, a policy that makes the state by its very function of, say, surveilling the population and providing security, for instance, generates data as a byproduct, a policy by which that data is shared with the firms. It may be optimal when economies of scope are strong enough, as I showed you before, but these are for reasons that have nothing to do with those that justify traditional industrial policies. So traditional industrial policies are often justified based on some market failure or externality. Here, there's no such thing. The only reason why it may be optimal to provide data to the firms is just because it's produced as a byproduct of the very same activities that the government is already doing, and because there are economies of scope. But it's not trying to correct an externality, it's not trying to correct any market failure. And and to the extent that this public data does not have a private substitute that is perfect, this may be optimal. And so that's one takeaway. Then the second takeaway is more on the political economy of innovation, and in particular, so we're studying more indirect ways in which the state may affect the direction and rate of innovation. For instance, thinking about surveillance states like China, and at the extreme of surveillance states, thinking about autocracies. And the literature has typically highlighted here how autocracies, in particular, may be detrimental for growth by screwing up a number of incentives or increasing expropriation risks or things like that. And in a data-intensive economy, like the one that I just showed you, it may be that that the objectives of a surveillance state that is trying to increase surveillance and as a result it will produce more data, actually aligns with promoting data-intensive innovation and growth overall, instead of being detrimental to it, precisely because they're going to be producing more data in equilibrium. And but of course, it may be terrible for citizens in terms of welfare. It may crowd out a lot of resources from consumption, as I show you, and it may also be detrimental if the preferences for surveillance between the state or an autocracy in particular do not align with the preference of the citizens. In particular, the citizens dislike surveillance, but the state does not, to pursue their own objectives, then this may be terrible for citizens. And then finally, I think this one is clear that if citizens have a disutility from data collection, in particular from the government, then this may decrease innovation, data-intensive innovation in equilibrium, but it may overall be beneficial to citizens in terms of welfare. Okay, that is all I have.
Thanks a lot, Martin. Open up for questions. I guess, can I ask about are you able to put some kind of value on the way the firms value the access to government data, or is it too hard to put that in interpretable units?
No, I think it would, but you would need to know, like we don't observe the sales of the software, for instance. That would be one way. If you
or
could,
from the bids, I guess.
The bids would be one. Yeah, how much they bid for a data reach or contract. We haven't done that. That maybe is a good idea to put a number. But like for instance, one thing that we have thought about is, so the numbers tell you that, you know, a contract coming from an above average, above median surveillance capacity location, we will need to know, you know, in some units in terms of cameras per capita, let's say. So we measure it like that. For each additional camera per capita in a location, how many more software releases do you have? So that answer we know, but then you would need to value somehow this software. So you would need like a price, for instance, for this software. And with those two things, you could potentially, you know, come up with a number for how valuable the data is. You know,
Okay, there's not a question yet. I want to push back. So I guess you said that you guys look at a lot of things to try to distinguish this from a learning by doing story.
Yeah.
I think it's to a large extent a learning by doing story. I mean, almost literally, at least for the software, it's learning by doing. I guess what is something that's different is that this is a very new technology. So it could be that you say you study what's the role of allocating a procurement contract on something that firms already know a lot about. I will expect that the result from that, especially for a company been doing something for a long time, that should be totally relevant. But can you elaborate a bit more on why you
of course.
want to distinguish this?
Cool. So again, this was the main thing that I worry about, and so
I'm not sure that you said that you need to worry about this. You want to fight again.
The mechanism. So I think in terms of the implications, to be honest, for a lot of things, it would be the same whether it's the data that is shareable and that creates the scope, or is it that there's learning by doing and that creates the scope. For a lot of the implications, I think it's.
But for the AI algorithm, is a learning by doing.
You can, so there's two.
Algorithm is
an intermediate point, just to jump in, which we note in the paper, which is one possibility is that the data that are used to produce government software are also used to produce a different, let's say, commercial algorithm. And that is possible. Another possibility is that the better sort of identification algorithm that's used as an input ultimately into government prediction software is now a better algorithm used for identification in commercial settings that then would be used for commercial prediction. So I love your point, and it could even produce a very nice, cute title, Machine Learning by Doing. But what we don't know is whether it is in fact the data that can be used in multiple ways or the algorithm that can be used in multiple ways. Both are possible. And I think both are different from traditional learning by doing, where you'd think that the firm is able to do something, you know, with a different level of productivity for having done it for the government. And that's something that we try to rule out in different ways. And I'll let Martin talk about that.
So I'm curious about it. Thank you.
Yeah. So that there's another layer of distinction, which is what Noam just said. So I'm not going to repeat it. But in terms of the learning by doing story, at least how I understood it is, of course, you know, if a firm gets a government contract that tells them, okay, now you're going to produce more for the government, then that can feed into, you know, as from a learning by doing, into producing, be more productive at doing the commercial. So that would be a question about the levels. And as I told you, you know, maybe there's a different paper to be written on the levels that are quite large. Why is it that when a firm obtains a government contract, it just produces both more government and commercial software? So that's one point, and that could be purely learning by doing. But to be able to explain the differential results, it would need to be somehow that when a contract is coming from a place that has a lot of cameras, then whatever that government software that is being contracted for, that allows you to learn more in terms of how you're going to do commercial software than when a contract comes from a location that has less cameras. And that's a story.
For example, suppose that I'm asking, instead of AI, and asking, I'm a surgeon, and whether if I'm a surgeon, I'm hired by the government to go to Iraq,
yeah,
and I get to be exposed to a lot of to patients.
Yeah,
I will have a differential effect if I'm a surgeon and I'm hired to go by the government to go to a small town in a rural area.
Okay.
And I would say it will be a very similar application. It's not data, it's patients, but yeah.
Paco, let me try to.
Sorry.
What I think is the difference. It is here that there's the contract is think of a bundle of two things. It's the government asks you to do something and it gives you the data. And you can think in principle of unbundling that. The government just gives someone the data without asking them to do something. And there you don't get the, if you want to think about that policy, it's important to distinguish whether it's the government asking you to do something or it's the data itself.
Absolutely, yes. I agree with you.
And then you say the evidence that point to it's just the data, not the doing.
The government could give away access to the data without making it part of a contract to do something for the government. And if you want to think of what the value of doing that is, then you need to separate the two things.
But going back to your question of Iraq in small versus, in small town versus large town in Iraq. So what that would look like is a different when I see, okay, what would be the software or the product that is being, the contract or the product that is being released. So I would see that in the language, there's a difference between what the product that is being released for the government and the contract is. So it would say, one would be a small location and one would be a large location. So that type of language would be different. But when we look at that, we actually don't see that type of differences above and beyond just in terms of the language of the contracts and the language of the government software that is being released. So between those coming from data rich versus data scarce locations. So that's one. And I think to me also just the fact that you can control for pre-software production of government or commercial or whatever, and this decreases the differential effects a bit, but it doesn't kill them.
We have some questions in the chat. So Carlos, do you want to ask your question out loud?
Yeah, maybe very quick. My doubt is how, I understand how data can allow people or firms to understand how consumers behave, how they relate between them and how they are going to consume products or commit crime or things like that. But it's hard for me to understand how the knowledge of consumers' behavior is going to translate into producing more software, right? Because one thing is knowing the relations between consumers, and another thing is exploit that relationship to create new software for some purpose. So it has to be, if there is some software that is really related to consumers' behavior, it should be easier to understand the logic behind your result.
Yeah, no, I don't think we have kind of anything to say about like the data that are getting access to. Again, the way we're measuring this proxy for data is really, we're thinking there's video coming from surveillance cameras and there's the video feed and that's it. So that's the way we're measuring data. And potentially then they also get access to names of these people with their images that the police department may have in their databases. So, but there's nothing else about, maybe whether people like to consume this product or not, or anything else. So that's why I think, one of the leading examples that we have is smart city versus smart retail as a commercial application, because they're very close in that sense that the commercial application is literally, identifying a customer in the video feed coming from a supermarket store, which is kind of similar to identifying a citizen going over some street and walking around. So, yeah.
Right. So for identification, it's clear that you can get data, and that is helpful.
Yeah.
But how does that help firms to produce more software? I don't see the link there.
So what this part of the software is identification. So providing identification services. It's not just prediction. And
but then it's more about learning how to identify people than about the data itself. I'm having problem with the division between learning by doing
identifying people is the crucial first stage in making predictions about people in a range of settings. And so, you know, our key assumption here is that the identification component that will significantly improve when one has access to more surveillance data is something that is easily transferable to a range of commercial applications.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, you may think that if you're just thinking about a store, like a number of stores,
Right.
just the number of faces and video that you get, and like just the quantity of data is relatively small. And in fact, you know, when you talk, there's quotes from large leading AI firms here, and when you ask them, and then there's statements of this, they say, look, most of our data is coming from the state. So
Right.
So
let me put an example maybe to see if I get it. If you have 100 faces, it's difficult to have classes to identify people with only 100 faces, right? But if you have 1 million, you can identify more classes of faces, and then it's easier to identify. When you want to create a new software, you have more clusters that you can put new people in, right? So that make it easier to create new software. That is kind of your story.
yeah, that's yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
There's a question from Matt. Go back and forth in the chat. Why don't you ask your question out loud?
Sure. Thanks, Isra. So I guess I was trying to build on Ezra's earlier question and sort of thinking about, you know, does the government just want to give the data to one firm here? Do they want to give it to many firms? You know, I guess I've been having a conversation with Noam about that. Thanks.
Yeah. No, excellent question. So I think of, you know, the idea, there's another policy that we don't look at in the model, which would be just not, so in our empirical setup, what we have is that only the firms that contract with the government are the ones that potentially get access to the government data. But of course, you could think about other types of policy by which you just make like a public database where there is videos from street cameras and just every firm could access that, and that would be a much more powerful policy. Now, there may be privacy concerns about that type of policy. And you know, even in economics, we don't do that. We typically need to sign, you know, NDAs and things like that to obtain access to a given data set, to write many papers at the same time. And which is exactly the story here, if you think about it. And but we don't, you know, some more sensitive data, and you may think that faces and names and videos from people may be sensitive. We don't do that. So, you know, that's the.
Cool. So if it's okay, just to quickly follow up, I mean, okay, so in this context, I guess I understand that. I was sort of thinking like the government produces a lot of data, and a lot of it actually they do make freely available. Like we all use lots of government data all the time, and so there's sort of a question about, you know, what, like, thinking outside of just the very narrow context, like what's the right government policy about a lot of this stuff, and whether you know you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, no. I think again, if we did the same policy in the model, for instance, I think some of the same trade-off would show up, which is that, you know, giving just data to the firms is worse, quote unquote, that just making the data, giving every firm data access. So you would, in that world, for instance, you would eliminate our second category of firm that only uses private data for commercial software innovation. They would also get access to some government data. So that would be the difference. It would further increase the growth rate, and it would bias the direction of innovation more compared to the policy that I studied. But it may crowd out even more resources, because, you know, the production of data comes out of the, you know, it takes resources for innovate and whatnot. So I think, again, would it be optimal to just give infinite, like just loads and loads of data? I don't know. There may be there's probably an interior solution there too. I don't know if I have more to say than that.